At my grandson's 7th birthday party, there was no seat for me. I noticed it the way you notice something small but wrong, like a picture frame slightly crooked on the wall, something easy to ignore if you wanted to pretend everything was fine. The backyard was decorated in bright blue and yellow, balloons tied neatly along the fence, a long table set with paper plates and plastic cups, each place marked with a little name card written in careful handwriting. I stood there for a moment, scanning the table once, then again, slower this time. Ethan, Lily, Mark, Jessica, even the neighbors' kids had seats. But not me. Oops, my daughter-in-law Ashley said lightly as she walked past me with a tray of cupcakes, her voice soft and almost playful. Looks like we didn't plan for you. I smiled. Not because it was funny, and not because I believed her. I smiled because in that exact moment, something inside me settled into place with a quiet kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The table wasn't crowded. There was space. Enough space for one more chair. Enough space for me. But there was no chair. And that was not an accident. I moved aside, letting a group of children rush past me toward the cake, their laughter high and bright in the warm afternoon air. The smell of grilled burgers drifted from the patio, mixing with the sugary sweetness of frosting. It was a perfect day. Sunny, mild, about 75 degrees, the kind of day people talk about later and call beautiful. I stood near the edge of it all, just outside the circle of folding chairs, holding the gift I had wrapped the night before, careful and precise, the corners folded neatly the way my husband used to like. No one asked me where I wanted to sit. No one noticed that I hadn't sat down at all. Daniel glanced at me once from across the yard, then quickly looked away, as if there was something urgent happening on his phone that required his full attention. I watched him laugh at something Ashley said, his posture relaxed, easy, like this was exactly where he wanted to be. Maybe it was. I stayed standing. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time has a strange way of stretching when you realize you're no longer part of something you once belonged. 2. A little girl tugged at Ashley's sleeve, asking where she should sit, and Ashley bent down, smiling warmly, guiding her to a chair with her name written in looping letters. Every seat had been planned. Every detail accounted for. I looked back at the table one more time, just to be sure I hadn't missed it, that maybe my name was tucked somewhere at the end, written smaller, less obvious. But there was nothing. Just an empty stretch of table between two chairs, as if a space had been left there on purpose, but never meant to be filled. I adjusted the handle of the gift in my hands and took a slow breath. Ashley had said, oops, like it was a mistake, like something small had slipped through the cracks. But I had lived long enough to recognize the difference between an oversight and a decision. And this was a decision. I shifted the gift slightly in my hands, the ribbon brushing against my wrist as I stepped closer to the table, not to sit, but to study it the way you study something that no longer makes sense. The name cards were not random. They were not rushed. Each one was written in the same careful script, evenly spaced, perfectly aligned with the plates and napkins. Even the smallest details had been considered, the kind of planning that takes time, intention, and attention. There were 12 seats in total. I counted them once, then again, slower, letting my eyes move from one name to the next. 12 people expected. 12 places prepared. I was not the 13th who arrived unannounced. Ashley had personally invited me 2 weeks ago, her voice sweet over the phone, reminding me of the time, the theme, even suggesting what kind of gift Ethan might like this year. There had never been any uncertainty about whether I would be here. And yet, there was no place for me to belong. I watched as she moved through the party with effortless precision, refilling drinks, adjusting decorations, laughing at just the right moments. She stopped beside the table briefly, straightening a napkin that was already straight, her fingers smoothing it with quiet satisfaction. This was not chaos. This was control. A young boy ran up and asked where he should sit, and she immediately guided him to his seat without hesitation, calling him by name, pointing exactly where he belonged. There was no confusion anywhere in this arrangement, except the absence that stood where I should have been. I felt the weight of that realization settle deeper, not sharp, not sudden, but steady, like something that had been building for a long time and had finally revealed its shape. I thought back to other gatherings, smaller moments I had brushed aside at the time. The Thanksgiving when my chair had been moved to the corner of the room, near the kitchen, because they said it was easier that way. The Christmas when my name had been left off the gift exchange list, and Ashley laughed it off as a simple mix-up. The family photo last summer where I had been asked to take the picture instead of being in it, because you always take the best photos. Each moment had been small, explainable, easy to forgive if you did not look too closely. But standing here now, looking at a table that had been planned down to the last detail, I understood something I had refused to see before. This was not forgetfulness. This was not oversight. This was design. I adjusted my grip on the gift again and glanced toward Daniel. He was helping Ethan unwrap a present, smiling as the boy tore through the paper, his voice warm and animated. For a second, I allowed myself to wonder if he had noticed, if he had seen the empty space where I should have been. But if he had, he gave no sign. He did not look toward me. He did not hesitate. He simply continued, as if everything around him was exactly as it should be. And maybe, to him, it was. I remained where I was, just far enough from the table to avoid being in the way, but close enough to see everything clearly, and that distance felt deliberate, like an invisible line had been drawn that I was not meant to cross. The children gathered around the cake, their voices rising in excitement as Ashley lit the candles one by one, her movements steady, practiced, almost graceful. 7 candles. 7 small flames flickering in the soft breeze. Ethan stood at the center, his cheeks flushed with happiness, his eyes bright as everyone began to sing. I joined in quietly, my voice blending into the group, though no one looked in my direction. When he blew out the candles, there was applause, laughter, the kind of warm noise that fills a space and makes it feel complete. I clapped too, holding the gift tighter against my side, waiting for that brief moment when children look around, searching for familiar faces, for grandparents, for someone to share their joy with. But Ethan's eyes moved past me without stopping, drawn instead to his friends, to his parents, to the circle that had formed naturally around him. I felt it then, not as a sharp pain, but as a quiet absence, like a space where something should have been but was not. Plates were passed around, slices of cake carefully distributed. Ashley moved from one guest to another, handing out pieces with a smile, making sure everyone had what they needed. When she reached the end of the table, she paused, glanced briefly in my direction, then turned back, as if reconsidering something, before continuing on without saying a word. No plate was offered to me. No fork. Nothing. I told myself it was not necessary. I was not hungry. I had eaten earlier. Small justifications that sounded reasonable in my head, even as they settled uncomfortably in my chest. A woman standing beside me, someone I vaguely recognized from the neighborhood, leaned slightly closer and said in a low voice, "You can take my seat if you want. I can stand." I turned to her and smiled, shaking my head gently. "No, thank you," I said, keeping my voice even. "I am fine right here." And in that moment, I realized something else, something that made the situation feel even clearer. It was not that there were no seats. There were plenty. People shifted, moved, adjusted. Space could have been made in seconds if anyone had chosen to make it. But no one did. Because the absence was not a problem to be solved. It was the plan itself. I looked back at Ashley, watching the way she laughed with another parent, her posture relaxed, her expression open and friendly, the picture of someone who had done everything right. And perhaps she had, in her own way. Everything was organized. Everything was smooth. Everything worked exactly as she intended. I lowered my gaze to the neatly wrapped gift in my hands, the paper still crisp, untouched, waiting for a moment that had not yet come. For the first time, I did not wonder where I should stand, or whether I should move closer. I already knew the answer. I was exactly where I had been placed. The party continued as if nothing was missing, as if every detail had been accounted for, and in a way, it had. I watched as gifts were opened one by one, bright wrapping paper torn apart and tossed aside, each present greeted with excitement, laughter, and the kind of attention that makes a child feel celebrated. I waited for a natural pause, a moment when it would make sense to step forward, to hand Ethan the gift I had chosen so carefully, something thoughtful, something meaningful. But the moment never came. Ashley stood close to him the entire time, guiding the order, stacking boxes neatly, deciding which gift came next, her voice soft but firm, keeping everything moving in a rhythm that did not include me. At one point, Daniel knelt beside Ethan, helping him read the tag on a present, and I found myself watching them longer than I intended. There was a time when Daniel used to look for me in moments like this, when his eyes would find mine across a room, sharing something unspoken, something simple and warm. That habit was gone now. Not replaced. Just gone. I shifted my weight slightly, my feet beginning to ache from standing, though I'd barely noticed the discomfort compared to the quiet understanding that had settled deeper with each passing minute. This was not a single moment of exclusion. This was a system, a pattern that had been built slowly, carefully, until it no longer needed to hide. I glanced toward the house, its back door open, the interior dim compared to the bright afternoon outside. For a brief second, I considered stepping inside, finding a chair somewhere, sitting down just to rest. But something stopped me. Not pride, not stubbornness. Something clearer than that. If I stepped away, nothing would change. If I stayed, nothing would change either. The difference was not in my movement. It was in my understanding. A woman nearby laughed at something Ashley said, and I heard my name mentioned, just faintly enough to catch my attention. She is very independent, Ashley was saying, her tone light, almost admiring. She prefers doing things her own way. I recognized the sentence immediately. It sounded kind, respectful, even, but I understood what it meant in this context. It meant distance. It meant justification. It meant explaining my absence in a way that made it seem like a choice I had made myself. I lowered my eyes for a moment, letting that realization settle without resistance. This was how it worked. Not loud, not obvious, just small shifts in language, in placement, in presence, until the story changed without anyone needing to say it directly. I looked down at the gift again, still unopened, still waiting, and something inside me grew very quiet, very still. Not hurt, not confusion, just clarity. The kind that does not arrive all at once, but builds slowly until there is nothing left to question. I had spent years believing that these moments were accidents, that misunderstandings could be explained, that relationships simply changed with time. But standing here now, watching everything unfold exactly as it had been arranged, I understood something I could no longer ignore. I had not been forgotten. I had been placed exactly where I was meant to be, just outside the frame, visible enough to acknowledge, but never included enough to matter. I did not move when the last of the gifts had been opened, when the torn paper was gathered into a loose pile, and the children scattered again toward games and laughter, their attention already shifting to the next small excitement. The moment for giving had passed without ever including me, and I understood that if I stepped forward now, if I placed the box into Ethan's hands, it would not be part of the celebration. It would feel like an interruption, something outside the rhythm of what had been planned. I let my fingers rest along the edge of the wrapping paper, smoothing a corner that did not need smoothing, a quiet habit I had carried for years. Nearby, two women were speaking in low voices, not whispering, but not intending to be heard either. Ashley is very particular about things, one of them said with a small, knowing smile. She likes everything organized. The other nodded. Well, it shows. Everything looks perfect. Perfect. I let the word settle in my mind for a moment, turning it over the way you do with something that sounds right, but feels incomplete. Because perfection, I realized, is not just about what is included. It is also about what is left out. I lifted my gaze again and watched Ashley from a distance, the way she moved through the space with quiet authority, adjusting small details, directing the flow of conversation without ever appearing to control it. She did not look at me again, not directly, but there were moments when her eyes passed over the area where I stood, quick, subtle glances that seemed to check that everything remained as intended, that I remained where I was. Daniel walked past me once, close enough that I could have spoken his name, close enough that he could have acknowledged me without breaking his stride. But he did not slow down. He did not turn his head. It was not avoidance in the obvious sense. It was something softer than that, something practiced, as if not seeing me had become easier than explaining why I was not part of the picture. I watched him join a group near the grill, laughing at something someone said, his shoulders relaxed, his expression open. He looked comfortable, at ease, and I realized that this arrangement, this quiet exclusion, did not disturb him. Not enough to change anything. The gift in my hands felt lighter now, not because its weight had changed, but because its meaning had. It was no longer something I was waiting to give at the right moment. It had become a question, a simple one. Who exactly was it for? I had chosen it for Ethan, of course. Thought about what he might enjoy, what would make him smile. But gifts are not only about the person receiving them. They are also about the connection they represent. And standing there, just outside the circle of voices and laughter, I began to understand that the connection I believed I was honoring might no longer exist in the way I had imagined. A breeze moved through the yard, lifting the edges of the tablecloth slightly, causing the name cards to flutter for just a second before settling back into place. Everything returned to stillness almost immediately, as if even the air knew not to disturb what had been carefully arranged. I looked at that table one last time, at the empty space where no chair had ever been placed, and I felt something inside me shift, not with pain, but with recognition. I had spent a long time trying to understand where I fit, trying to adjust, to accommodate, to remain part of something that no longer made room for me. But now, standing exactly where I had been positioned, I realized something that felt both simple and undeniable. It was not that I had lost my place. It was that my place had been quietly removed, long before I ever noticed it was gone. I did not leave right away, even though a part of me understood that nothing more was waiting for me there, that whatever role I thought I had already played had quietly been written out long before this afternoon. Instead, I stayed just a little longer, watching the way the light shifted as the sun began to lower, casting longer shadows across the yard, stretching the edges of everything just slightly. The children had moved on to another game, their laughter drifting farther away, no longer centered around the table, no longer held together by a single moment. Conversations broke into smaller groups, softer, more casual, the kind that do not require everyone to be included. I stood near the same spot, not because I felt rooted there, but because moving felt unnecessary. Nothing around me was asking me to move closer. Nothing invited me in. A man I did not recognize nodded politely as he passed, offering a brief smile, the kind given out of habit rather than connection. I returned it, just as briefly, and watched him take a seat at the table, sliding easily into a place that had been waiting for him. I noticed then how natural it all looked from the outside. If someone had arrived at that moment, they would have seen a well-organized gathering, a happy family, everything in its place. They would not have noticed the absence. Or if they did, they would have assumed it meant nothing. Because absence, when done quietly enough, becomes invisible. I turned my attention back to the house again, the open doorway still there, still offering the same quiet interior, a space untouched by the noise outside. For a moment, I imagined myself inside, sitting at the kitchen table, perhaps pouring a glass of water, taking a seat that no one had assigned, creating my own place where none had been given. It would have been simple, easy even, but the thought passed as quickly as it came. That would not change what had already been made clear. This was not about finding a chair. It was about understanding why there had never been one. Ashley's voice carried across the yard again, light and composed, thanking someone for coming, her tone warm, gracious, exactly as expected. She was good at this, at creating an atmosphere where everything appeared complete, where no one questioned what was missing because what remained was so carefully arranged. I felt no anger as I listened, no sharp edge of resentment, just a quiet acknowledgement of something that had already taken shape long before today. Daniel's laughter followed hers a moment later, blending into the low hum of conversation, and I realized that for him, this was enough. This version of things, this arrangement. He was not waiting for something to feel wrong. He had already accepted that this was right. I lowered my gaze once more to the gift in my hands, still unopened, still carrying a meaning that no longer matched the moment. Slowly, I adjusted the ribbon, smoothing it down with careful fingers, the same way I had done the night before, though now the gesture felt different. Not preparation, not anticipation, just closure. I took a small step back, then another, creating a little more distance between myself and the table, between myself and the space that had never included me. No one stopped me. No one called my name. The movement did not interrupt anything. It simply happened, unnoticed, as everything else continued exactly as planned. And as I stood there, just beyond the edge of it all, I understood something with a certainty that did not need to be spoken. They had not asked me to leave. They had not needed to. Because when there is no place set for you, leaving is not a decision. It is the only position that remains. I turned slightly toward the gate, not in a hurry, not making any kind of statement, just allowing my body to follow what my mind had already accepted. The grass beneath my shoes felt uneven in a way I had not noticed before, each step deliberate, quiet, almost careful, as if I did not want to disturb the scene behind me even though I was no longer part of it. The voices continued without pause, laughter rising and falling in soft waves, the sound of a life moving forward without interruption. I paused once, just briefly, near the edge of the yard, and looked back, not searching for anything, not expecting anyone to call out or notice, just looking. The table was still there, exactly as it had been, the chairs filled, the empty space still empty, as if it had always been that way. Ashley stood near the center, speaking with someone, her expression composed, her posture relaxed, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair that had never been mine. Daniel was beside her now, nodding along, his face open, engaged, comfortable. There was no tension in him, no hesitation, no glance in my direction. I held that image for a moment, not as something painful, but as something final, something that did not need to be questioned anymore. Then I turned back and continued walking. The gate creaked softly as I opened it, a small, ordinary sound that somehow felt louder than everything else, though no one reacted to it. I stepped through and closed it behind me, the latch settling into place with a quiet click. Outside, the street was calm, lined with parked cars, a few leaves scattered along the sidewalk, the air slightly cooler away from the warmth of the crowd. I stood there for a second, adjusting my grip on the gift, feeling its edges against my palm, still neat, still untouched. For a moment, I considered going back, not to rejoin them, but simply to hand it over, to complete what I had come there to do. But the thought faded almost immediately. That gesture belonged to a different version of this day, one where I still believed I had a place at that table. I began to walk down the sidewalk at an even pace, the kind that does not draw attention, the kind that blends into the background of any neighborhood afternoon. A car passed slowly, music playing faintly through open windows, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Everything felt ordinary, and yet, something inside me had shifted in a way that could not be undone. It was not anger, not sadness in the way I had once understood it. It was clarity, clean, quiet, undeniable. I no longer found myself replaying small moments, trying to reinterpret them, trying to find softer explanations. There was nothing left to reinterpret. The pattern was complete. The meaning was clear. I had spent years adjusting myself to fit into a space that had been slowly closing, telling myself that change was natural, that distance happened, that relationships evolved. But what I had seen today was not evolution. It was removal. Careful, gradual, intentional. I reached the corner and slowed slightly, looking both ways out of habit before stepping forward, even though there were no cars coming. The sun was lower now, casting a softer light across the street, the kind that makes everything look gentler than it really is. I stopped for a moment on the other side, not because I needed to rest, but because I wanted to mark the moment in my own way. Not with words, not with any outward sign, just a quiet acknowledgement. Then I looked down at the gift in my hands once more, the ribbon still perfectly tied, the paper still smooth, and for the first time, I understood that it was no longer something waiting to be given. It was something I had carried to the end of a place that no longer existed for me, and I did not need to carry it any further. The walk home felt shorter than usual, though I moved at the same steady pace, each step measured, each breath even, as if my body understood before my mind fully caught up that something had ended and something else had quietly begun. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had, trimmed lawns, mailboxes lined up in quiet order, the occasional porch light flickering on as the afternoon softened into early evening. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I reached my front door and paused for a moment before unlocking it, my hand resting lightly against the handle, feeling the cool metal beneath my fingers. Inside, the house greeted me with the same stillness it always held when I returned alone. No voices, no movement, just the quiet hum of a space that belonged entirely to me. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the soft click echoing briefly before fading into silence. I placed the gift carefully on the kitchen counter, not setting it aside carelessly, but positioning it with the same precision I had used when wrapping it. The ribbon was still perfectly tied, the paper still smooth. It looked exactly as it had when I had left, as if the entire afternoon had not happened at all. I stood there for a moment, looking at it, and realized that for the first time, I did not feel the urge to correct anything, to adjust it, to prepare it for another attempt. There would be no second moment, no later opportunity. That part of the story had already closed. I walked to the sink and filled a glass with water, the sound of it running steady and uncomplicated, something simple and honest. I took a sip and leaned slightly against the counter, letting the quiet settle around me. My eyes moved across the room, taking in the familiar details, the framed photos on the wall, the small marks of time that had once felt like proof of a shared life. I noticed how many of those photos had been taken by me, not including me, capturing moments I had helped create but had not been part of. At the time, it had felt natural, generous, even. Now, it looked different. Not wrong, just incomplete. I set the glass down and walked slowly toward the hallway, my footsteps soft against the floor, each one grounding me further in a space that had never required me to earn my place. There was no need to ask where I belonged here. No need to search for a chair, or a name card, or a signal that I was included. Everything was already mine, not in a way that needed to be proven, but in a way that simply existed. I stopped near the living room and looked back toward the kitchen, toward the small, neatly wrapped box resting exactly where I had left it. It no longer felt like something meant to be given. It felt like something that had revealed its purpose by not being used. A quiet marker of a moment when I had finally seen clearly what had been hidden in plain sight for so long. I did not feel anger. I did not feel the need to call anyone, to explain, to question, or to demand anything in return. Those impulses had already dissolved somewhere between that empty space at the table and the quiet walk home. In their place was something steadier, a kind of understanding that did not require anyone else to acknowledge it in order to be true. I turned off the kitchen light and let the room dim slightly, the evening settling in around me, calm and unhurried. For the first time in a long while, I was not thinking about where I should be, or whether I had been included, or what I might have done differently. I was only aware of what was already clear. They had arranged their world without me. And now, standing in a space that had always made room for me without question, I understood that I no longer needed to stand at the edges of theirs. I did not touch the gift again that evening, not because I had forgotten it was there, but because I had already decided, without needing to say it out loud, that it no longer belonged to the moment it had been prepared for. Instead, I moved through my house slowly, turning on a lamp in the living room, adjusting the curtains just slightly, small movements that required no thought, no second guessing. The kind of movements that come naturally when you are in a place where nothing needs to be explained. I sat down in my usual chair, the one by the window, and rested my hands in my lap, letting the quiet settle fully this time, without interruption. For years, I had believed that belonging meant staying, adjusting, finding ways to remain part of something even when it became uncomfortable, even when the space grew smaller. I had told myself that patience was strength, that understanding would eventually lead to balance, that if I gave enough, stayed steady enough, things would find their way back to where they had been. But sitting there now, I saw how quietly that belief had been used against me, not in a cruel or obvious way, but in a way that made me accept less and call it peace. I leaned back slightly, my gaze drifting toward the hallway, then back to the kitchen where the gift still rested, unchanged, waiting for nothing. It occurred to me then that the absence I had felt all afternoon was not something new. It had been there in smaller ways for a long time, in moments I had softened, explained away, reshaped into something easier to accept. Today had not created that absence. It had simply revealed it in a way I could no longer ignore. I stood up after a while and walked back into the kitchen, stopping a few feet away from the counter. The box looked exactly the same, but I did not see it as something unfinished anymore. I saw it as something complete, not because it had been given, but because it had shown me what I needed to understand. I reached for it then, lifting it carefully, feeling its weight one last time, and for a brief moment, I imagined Ethan opening it, his small hands pulling at the ribbon, his face lighting up the way children's faces do when they are surprised. The image was clear, vivid, and then it faded, not with sadness, but with acceptance. That moment did not belong to me anymore. I turned and carried the gift down the hallway, not to store it away, not to hide it, but simply to place it somewhere it would no longer be mistaken for something waiting. When I returned to the living room, I did not feel lighter or heavier. I felt steady, grounded in a way that did not depend on anyone else's recognition. I sat down again and looked out the window as the sky dimmed further, the last of the daylight slipping away, replaced by the soft glow of streetlights turning on one by one. There was no need to decide anything immediately, no need to act or react. That would come later, in its own time, with the same quiet certainty that had carried me through the afternoon. For now, it was enough to understand this much. They had removed my place at their table without saying a word. And in doing so, they had given me something far more valuable than a seat. They had shown me exactly where I stood. And more importantly, where I no longer needed to stand at all.